Okay, we are moving on. Our next keynote speaker is Dave Whiteland from mySocietyj. He will talk about sharing things that work.
Okay, let's see how this goes. Okay. Right, has everyone got the Wi-Fi key? Because you'll probably want to be playing games on the internet for the next hour. Okay, here we go. I think I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this. Okay. Oh. Does this work? Yes. Right. My name's Dave Whiteland. I work for mySocietyj.org. I joined the organization as a programmer, so I am a dev, but now I'm in the international team. I'm going to be speaking mainly English, but I have learned Croatian since I've been here, so there's going to be some Croatian in this bilingual presentation. Right. I'm going to give you two presentations for the price of one. I'm going to talk about mySocietyj and tell you what we do, and then I'm going to talk about the Populous Federation, which is what I'm really here to tell you about. So the first thing is mySocietyj has been in the civic coding field for 10 years. That makes us old men in this place, and we make websites and tools that empower citizens. We started in the UK. I'm going to show you some of the websites that we built in the UK, but now the code behind them is being used in many countries around the world. So here's a simple example of something we do. Theyworkforyou.com is the UK Parliamentary Monitoring website that we've been running. In the UK, government publishes the activity of the house, the two houses, each morning in a document called Hansard. We scrape this. It's actually now available in HTML and XML, a government that publishes its business in XML, can you imagine? Actually, we parse the HTML for reasons that are slightly historic. What this means is we have structured data of what is happening in government. So I can put in my postcode here. In the UK, the postcode is a very useful way to identify your location. Good for about 20 addresses. Because we have structured data, it has told me who my MP is and how he has voted, because we have analyzed the voting patterns of the members of parliament since we have data. Now, in the UK, the parliament does not publish the voting data numerically, so we have to parse it out of the record, the narrative of events, which used to be PDF, now is, as I say, HTML or XML. This is a very popular service. Because it is structured data, we know when your MP speaks, we know what he's talking about. So you can ask for an email notification every day whenever your MP, what did my MP do yesterday? Or if you are interested in, I don't know, hamsters, then you could ask for an email every time hamsters are mentioned. In fact, every morning, we send around 30,000 emails to citizens in the UK who have subscribed to this service. That's impressive for a nation which is fundamentally an apathetic electorate. This shows if you have structured data, people want to use it. We also, of course, look at the analytics and know that the website is accessed by a lot of people in Parliament. Here's another example of what we do. FixMyStreet. I have a pothole or a broken street light, or maybe a dead dog, or an overhanging tree. I put in a location, maybe my postcode, or maybe the name of the town where I live. In the UK, normally, there are two authorities responsible for an area, the town and the county. Most people do not know who is responsible for what. I click on the map, it's shown me to say where my problem is, and it will invite me to fill out a form, as I'll show you. We know where to send the report to. We send the report typically by email to the right person in the right government department. The reason we do this is because most local government websites are not very easy to use. This is changing. but in general, people find it difficult to report a problem. There are a number of reasons for this. If you're very cynical, it might be because you'd think local government doesn't want you to report it. But here's another example of what we build. Whatdotheyknow.com is our Freedom of Information website. You can ask a freedom of information to any one of these public bodies. We have the contact details of over 15,000 public bodies. So you go to this website, pick a body, submit your request. This covers pretty much any public funded body, which includes universities. So an example here is, I live just down the road from Royal Holloway, University of London. If I'm interested to know, do they do experiments on animals at the top of the hill? I can ask that under an FOI request. And in the UK, I can expect a reply in 20, give or take 20 days. Most people don't know how to do that. So the website, of course, makes it easy for them. And here's an example of somebody last year who asked exactly this. They asked for what animals and how many are you testing on at the top of the hill. There you fill in the form. The website sends the email on their behalf. The email address is something like an MD5 hash. So when the authority replies, we know they reply by email. We know which request they are replying to, and we publish the answer. Could I just point out, Ojeve Rochka. Okay, I'll carry on. Now, the important thing about this is that this answer on the website is automatically published. So when you make your FOI request, we automatically publish the responses from the authority. We publish them and we SEO them heavily. We make sure that the Google spiders get everything right about this page. Now, the reason this matters is because most people do not wake up in the morning and think, I want to make a freedom of information request. Some of you do, most of you don't. But people do worry about how much money did my local council spend on last year's Christmas tree because it was rubbish. Or are they conducting experiments on animals at Royal Holloway? So they will ask Google. And it's part of the engagement with people is to realize that your brand, your service, does not begin on your website. It begins at the point of interaction with the internet that the people are using. In this case, somebody might ask about hamsters. You can see they had 82 hamsters were being researched in 2012. And if there were any investigative journalists in the room, there might be a story here about why they have stopped working on hamsters. The point about this is the person who looked for the information gets the answer because it is published, and also learns that this is what freedom of information can be used for. So actually we know about 20 people look at the response for every request. So this is a way of spreading information because freedom of information is typically asker agnostic. The reply must not depend on who you are. If you ask, you get the same answer that I ask. So really, government should be publishing the responses, but we do that for them. I chose hamster because it happens to be one of the words that I know in Croatian. Although harder to pronounce than I expected. Of course, we put the source code on GitHub. Actually, the software running this is called Alavatelli and is running in about 16, 17 countries in the world now. Now, the reason I've shown you this, because actually you're not all that interested in what websites you can use in the UK. The reason I've shown you this is because in each of these things, there is a lot of experience and time embedded in the code. Let me show you something about what I mean. Right. When I reported the pothole, I told you I put my postcode in there, or maybe the name of the town. And we use that to find which map to draw. Okay, nothing that surprising. In fact, I think we use the OSM geocoder for that lookup to get a lat long. But actually, at that point, we also check the population density against the gazetteer for that location. So before we show you this map, we check the population density to guess if you are urban or rural. Because the zoom level on this map will be different according to whether or not you are in the countryside or in the town. Because we have learned from experience that if you're in a town, you want a close-up of all the little streets. But if you're in the countryside, maybe this map would just be white. So we zoom out. Actually, we also use different source of maps depending on the zoom level. And the other thing that I want to show you, let's go back. The other thing is you've come to this website to report a problem, a pothole. But the first question we ask you isn't, what's your problem? The first question we ask you is, where are you? One question. Now, if you designed this from scratch, you would probably make a form. You know your HTML form tag. It's there for this purpose. And you'd say, what kind of problem is it? Maybe a drop-down, a select options. Where are you? Describe. We don't do a form. Well, it's a form. We don't do a form with many entries. We ask one question. Because the user gets that question right 100% of the time. It is an easy question which your user will get right. This means they're now having a happy and successful experience on your website. Already, they are engaged because nothing has gone wrong. That's more useful than you think. But also, it's given us the opportunity to put the map in the right place and also show you other problems that people have reported. So if the problem you're about to report has already been reported, you're not going to do that. So we're stopping duplicate reports going to the council. But we never told you that's what we were going to do. It's hidden in the user experience because we asked you, where are you, first. It gave us the opportunity to put this in your way. Now, when you click on the map to locate your problem, doink, at that point, the form appeared. And a key thing here is that this category, pick a category, contains pothole, dead dog, street light. But actually, that list is made up of these two councils. So when you clicked on the map, we called an external service and which asks, which administrations is this point in? Who is responsible for fixing problems? We get two answers. We get the list of all the services that those two councils provide, and we put them in this category. So if neither of these councils will help you with a fallen tree, it's not an option that we can send to, so it won't appear here. So another way of explaining this is we could not draw this form until you had clicked on the map. But if you build the user interface correctly, people don't notice that you are guiding them in this useful way. The last thing is we don't ask who you are until down here. Most council websites want to ask who you are as the first question. This is not the right way to build a civic website. Nope. So the point about this is we make the software available as open source, but details like that, our experience of user interface design, our experience of building sites which civic users want to use, is embedded in the code, as well as the time to write this. FixMyStreet has been running since 2007. So when you download the GitHub repo and you think you're getting code, actually there's a lot in that code which maybe you don't understand you're getting. So that's about mySocietyj. If you come and live in the UK, these sites would be useful to you. But for the last few years, we have been helping people install internationally. We get philanthropic grants, so we're funded to help in other countries. And I think I can safely show, here's an example of FixMyStreet running in Zurich. Zurich actually has no problems in its streets to fix. The Zurich Council that run this themselves provided their own maps, which are exquisite, beautiful, and their own satellite imagery. And you can see that even the roofs in Zurich are clean. They also had, I think, 17th century parchment maps which they had geo-corrected, which were beautiful, but sadly they did not go live with us. So, right. That's kind of the first half, the first bit of my presentation about mySocietyj. That's where I'm from. I'm now in the international team, traveling around, meeting people, using our software, helping them, and spreading the word about Poplus, which is a collaboration we have started with a group in Chile. Oye, Bas. This is the head of security at the Fundación Ciudadano Inteligente, a civic hacking group in Chile, who are our partners on Poplus. They're building civic websites in the same kind of way that mySocietyj has been doing in the UK. So Ciudadano Inteligente and mySocietyj combined to form the start of the Poplus Federation, which is what I'm going to describe to you now. We launched with a conference in Santiago. Sorry, this is Ciudadano Inteligentes have a lot of civic websites they're successfully running already. This is an example of the kind of thing they're doing. We ran a conference in Santiago a couple of months ago. We got about just under 100 attendees from 27 countries to talk about a better way to share civic code of the kind that we're building. I should also say, wardrobe change to keep you interested. Yeah. So the Poplus Federation and components, I'm going to show you examples of the kind of problem this is attempting to solve. Why we're doing it, which is fundamentally because of the frustration of waste, and how we're going to do it. So let me tell you, I'm going to give you some specific examples of this in a minute, so it's easy to understand what I mean. Why is because the civic coding world, not unlike the open software world of which it is part, is not awash with money. Our problem is not the Silicon Valley problem of how to spend all our money on swanky offices. The problem is actually so much work, developer time, good developer time is expensive, and there's so much duplication of people building the same things again and again that this really is a frustration which became the itch which we needed to scratch. And the way we're proposing to do it is slightly more intelligent sharing of the components behind the systems that we're building. So here we go. Here's a very simple example use case. Just suppose somebody has a list of their members of parliament. This is not necessarily easy depending on the jurisdiction or the country you live in, but maybe somebody has managed to get a spreadsheet of this information. It should be as easy for them to set up a database of politicians as it is to set up a Tumblr blog. So if they have the data, which often is the hardest part of the problem of setting up a civic site, if they have the data, now they need to find a programmer. They need to find a programmer who did databases in his or her computer science degree. They will build that database with probably a people table, and they will have maybe a parties table for the people table to have a relationship with. You can see how this is going. If, instead of a list of politicians, they had collected a number of photographs of kittens, the internet would not present them with this problem. If you have a lot of photographs of kittens, it is easy to set up a blog to share them with the world. So there's something a bit wrong that this is not the case just because you have politicians instead of kittens. As part of my research, I have checked this is true. These are the kitten tags on Tumblr. This suggests to me that it is easy for non-technical people to set up a blog if they are equipped with a collection of photographs of kittens. So, is it feasible to make it easy to make a database of politicians? I know maybe politicians are not as attractive to look at as kittens, but we're technical here, so understand the data underneath this. Fundamentally, a cat is just a data point. Here's an example of Poppet. Poppet is our component for database of people. Here's one we've made for the South African Parliament. Somebody who's already taken the politicians and put them in. This is now presenting it in a nice web interface. I'm showing you this because it exists. So we made the let's make a database of politicians component. Let's call it a website. Here's what the user does. They enter data. The complexity of this data is hidden as much as possible. It's published with a nice web interface. You get your CRUD so you can edit and change them. I mentioned maybe you have a spreadsheet, so there's import, and maybe that's all you need. Bang, you have your website of politicians. But actually, if that website comes with a useful API, then the developer can build the website using that without having to waste the time, maybe Postgres, maybe MySQL, building that part of the production. Now, because we are amongst nerds here, you're thinking, but it's easy to build a database. It comes as part of the territory of being a programmer. But it's not as easy as you think because of the problem domain. So the database is not the problem. If you do this yourself, you will make the people table. You'll put the people in there. You'll have the parties for the different parties they belong to. Maybe you'll realize that there are leaders of the parties, so you need the ID, maybe a table of roles. Then you have maybe a president or a prime minister, which belongs to not one of the parties. This starts to get complicated. When you say to your friend who has the data, yes, I'll build this database for you, you're thinking of a person table. You're not thinking about the complexity of political structure. Anyone who's built one of these discovers that when the election comes around in 3 or 4 years' time and these people change, you didn't think of that because now the person who links to Prime Minister and President is breaking the pages on the site where you were linking to the Prime Minister and President. So suddenly you realize you have dates involved, a period of time over which somebody belongs to a party. I said belongs to a party. Does anybody ever change party? Maybe when I said party, I meant a coalition of parties which exist for a short time. Suddenly, from a programming point of view, this is where you stop answering the emails and you go and work on a kitten database because kittens don't do this to you. So we have seen this happen again and again, that people misunderstand that the problem setting up a civic site is not technical because the technical solution exists amongst brilliant nerds. There is no shortage of talented programmers in the dev community, although actually getting that resource to help on a civic project is not quite so straightforward. But the problem is in the subtlety of the problem domain. So if we have a component for doing this that has already built in the understanding and the experience of this structure, this is what you should be using to start with. So for example, I showed you Poppet, which is designed to do this. It made a beautiful website that you could share, that the person who had the politician data could share with their friends. Their friends would be disappointed because they'd rather be looking at kittens, but let's suppose they are politically engaged friends. As the programmer, you don't care about that web interface. You're interested in the API. So to start with, you build a prototype of a parliamentary monitoring website that hits that database of politicians over the API. We'll host it for you, so there's no problem in getting that started. When you get a little more into it, you think this is silly. There's latency making HTTP requests across the web. So host it on localhost, and you're using the same API. And when you get closer to production, you think, actually, I want to be making native library calls. Well, you use the same API. So the idea here is that when somebody has the idea to use this data, the time spent setting the database up and setting the models up is not wasted at the start of the project. The start of the project is when you want the devs to be solving the business logic part of the service and the website you're building. It's called POP-IT because it handles people, organizations, and positions. And as I've described, it's not easy. It looks easy, but it's not easy in the real world. And actually, we're using Popola. So the structure, the schema, is not ours. It's effectively an open standard, which means that, of course, other tools which are already using Popola can benefit as well. Here's the website. There are links at the end. This is already in use in civic sites. Ciudadano Inteligente in Chile are already running with it. I'll show you another example, which is a bit easier, which you've already seen. Map it. If you give it a lat long, it will tell you which areas that lat long is inside. We're running one called Global Map It, mySocietyju.org, which is already loaded with all the admin boundary data from OpenStreetMap. Here's an example I picked at random. This is hitting Map It. Of course, it's a beautiful website because effectively the API is responding with HTML here. And after all, as we have learned through REST, that the web is just another vehicle for API. So this is showing the areas that OpenStreetMap knows about. It's OpenStreetMap data running on our server. I can click on that and see the extent of the admin boundary that's available. This is useful, for example, you've seen two examples of this already. When I entered my postcode to find out who my MP was, who my Member of Parliament was, we use MapIt to find which constituency that point is within. When I used FixMyStreet to report a pothole, we used this service to find out which councils were responsible. And of course, the data we've looked at was for humans, but you're not humans. You're interested in consuming this kind of thing. Right. Here's another example of another component. So I've shown you POP-IT for people, MapIt for geometry in geography. Here's one about meetings. Everything you can and cannot do has been decided in a meeting. The problem is, in our normal lives, the record of those meetings is not made well available to us. The extreme example is legislation, the bills produced in Parliament. And maybe you can see the meetings where those happened. Incidentally, by definition, these are meetings between powerful people. They're powerful because they are affecting your lives, even and especially in local government. And in general, the more local you become, the harder it is to find and see the records of these meetings. So wouldn't it be great if there was a way to make transcripts beautiful, make them things of beauty? A transcript is just a record of an exchange of speech. So, say it is the component I'm about to show you. We make it readable. I'll show you what that means. Linkable, shareable, searchable, and we're using an open standard. So, which is Nkoma Otoza from the African Parliament Project. That is selling it short. It's also in use in the Library of Congress in the US and in the European courts as well. Increasingly being adopted. It is an XML standard for parliamentary and legal record. So, how am I doing for time? Right, Harry Potter was written by J.K. Rowling. And when the final book was going to be published, the press were very interested to find out what happened. And part of that interest manifested itself by a journalist putting a note into J.K. Rowling's daughter's lunchbox in her school. So when she got home, she found a note for her mother. Some people would consider this an intrusion of the press. This is one example of several which caused a parliamentary inquiry in the UK into the extent of press intrusion and press freedom, the behavior of the press and its accountability. It was called the Leveson Inquiry because the judge running it was Lord Justice Leveson. And it was triggered because of a case of a missing and, as it transpired, murdered schoolgirl, Millie Dowler. One of the papers, the News of the World, and I think some of you might even have heard of this story, got access to her mobile phone by, I think, using the default voicemail code. So there was activity on her phone records which led the parents to believe she was still alive. This was the press intrusion which triggered the Leveson Inquiry. So the government held a big inquiry and they brought many well-known witnesses because celebrity is part of the problem. And this is an example of J.K. Rowling coming to the inquiry to give her evidence. This is the official transcript. This is what effectively the government published. It is a PDF. Not only is it PDF, it is a PDF where each page is split into 4 pages. So if you've done any parsing or web scraping, this is hostile. But I would suggest to you, if you've ever read a book, this is hostile. This is a very strange way to lay something out for people to read. And there's an interesting thing here, that there's page numbers and numbers. Some attempt has been made to make it possible to refer to a point within this inquiry. This inquiry ran for many months. This is a medieval mechanism of referring to a point in a document, but that's what the government did. It probably wasn't cheap either. So we took this data, we turned it into a Comet and Tozer XML, and we put it into SayIt. This is what SayIt looks like. This is the same thing. In case it's not clear why I'm telling you this, people in the UK knew about the Leveson Inquiry because the press were reporting on it. Obviously, there is a conflict in interest in what the press chose to report. So most people only knew the bits that the press were telling them. It turns out it's a very interesting inquiry, if only people could read it. So because we've broken it into structured data, you can do things like this. You can find all the places that J.K. Rowling spoke. You can search for everywhere where she said horse, cat, dog, whatever. You can't do this on a PDF. But more to the point, as you see here, I'm hovering over it in this place, you can link to any part of the document. It's not a document, any part of the structured data. And what that means today is you can tweet it. You can share it on Facebook. So when somebody in a meeting says, you must wear purple boots at the weekend, and you say, this is ludicrous, this is wrong, and you try to gather support, you should be able to share the source of that information. This is where somebody said, you must wear purple boots. Without that ability to show where it's been said, it's already weakened your ability to protest, maybe is too strong a word, but to share the truth of the situation. The People's Assembly in South Africa is a parliamentary website that our software is running, which uses SayIt to show the government record, their Hansard, as part of the website. I have more examples. So I've done transcripts for meetings, geography, and people. Another component is for tracking bills and documents through their parliamentary life cycle. Write it for emailing individuals. Vote it, a voting tracker. And accountability is an interesting one, which has been proposed by a group in Malaysia, who, of course, as programmers, are familiar with GitHub issues. Now, they want to be able to track corruption in their parliament, and they already are using Poppet as the people database. And they said, corruption is fundamentally, a corrupt politician is fundamentally a bug. It's a politician with a bug. So we want a bug tracking system for politicians. And you know what they did? They started using GitHub and found it worked really well. So if you put, instead of your repo, you put into your GitHub repo, instead of code, you put politicians, you can actually have a decent stab at this. Oh, we're running ahead. With issue tracking on people. So these components I've shown you exist to some extent. The Populist Federation that I've been discussing is very loose. We're inviting anyone to join. Doesn't cost you any money, doesn't cost you anything other than an interest in sharing this kind of idea. In order to qualify as a component, it has to have these 7 things. But this is very rough because everything is in flux at the moment. We're interested in getting things to work through cooperation at this stage. I'm sure there will be bitter arguments later down the road over technicalities, but for now, we're interested in any code that helps solve that would help a civic or democratic website. It turns out that for our demonstration of Say It, we've used the Leveson Inquiry, the trial of Charles Taylor in Liberia, and the plays of Shakespeare. Because it turns out a transcript is anything, and plays are transcripts of things which didn't really happen or haven't happened yet. I'm not sure. It solves a single problem. These aren't websites. We've built websites and we make our websites available for other people to reuse, and we've learned from experience that a website that works in the UK is not going to work in the same way in Croatia, it's not going to work the same way in Malaysia, because there are always going to be cultural differences, particularly in Parliament. The structure of parliaments is so varied. That's why we break down into components instead of a website, because we know they're going to be more shareable. This means it plays nicely with the other components. You can imagine Say It. The meetings have the idea of speakers. So those speakers, of course, ideally would be coming from a database of people. They don't have to, but if they did, you should be able to do it. Whoa, it's platform agnostic. This cannot possibly be true, right? What are these written in? We've got them in, well, there's a trendy one in Node. They're in PHP, Django Python seems quite popular. This really means they're exposed. You can use them through an interface which generally is a web service, but it doesn't have to be. For example, they could be email-based components as well. So what this means is it's useful to you regardless of the language that the code that you prefer to write, typically because you're hitting it over a HTTP API, maybe hosted somewhere else to start with. There's always the idea that you bring these things in for production. It's country agnostic. Naively, this means this is the Freedom of Information site running in Israel. If you've ever done any web development, you're impressed by this for the rather childish reason that that is right to left, and it still works. If you're not technical, how hard can that be, right? Of course, this is free and open source software. It was interesting about the use of proprietary software coming up earlier. Sometimes that's very tempting, particularly because of the interaction with government websites at the far end. But fundamentally, the components have to be free and open source for this to work, and it has a stable and well-documented API. Right, so that was a bit like me reading a list. So what does this really mean? The challenging thing that we've learned is open source is not enough. You must have good documentation, you must have a community, you must have support in that community, which means, in our case, full-time staff actively helping people using it, and you have to share the stories. What do I mean by that? If we go back to me describing how FixMyStreet asks one simple question at the start. This is a very deliberate and battle-worn technique that we've learned. So we share that kind of information with people who are starting to use FixMyStreet. It's not okay to say, here's my repo, you can use my code. So that was the Populous Federation. Please have a look. I've shown you lots, maybe too many examples of use cases. I've told you why, because this redundancy of keep building the same thing again and again in the components underneath these websites is silly and expensive, and we're going to do it by better sharing. The thing missing from there, it's my big finish, the thing missing from there is actually who. And we're inviting anyone. It doesn't need to be technical. It can be anyone who has an interest in civic websites as a user, or particularly it can be people writing something. If you've written something which looks like a component already, then we want to know about it. What it means, if it's accepted as a Populous component, is it gets added to the catalog on the website, which increasingly is where people will be looking to share them. It will be evangelized by people using other components, and other staff come in to help to maybe bring the documentation up to scratch, or user testing, things like this. Right, at the end, this is the mySocietyj public relations cat, called Sushi Nori, if you're interested. Oye machka. Right, that has told you about mySocietyj and populous.org, so I invite any questions, queries, or if anyone wants to tell me how good my Croatian was, I'd appreciate that as well. Thanks to the volunteers who trained me in the last 24 hours, my Croatian coaches. Thank you very much, my language tutors.
Hi. Are you meeting with any Croatian civic hackers on this trip?
On this trip, I'm not, but I think some of you already know Tony Bowden, who works with my colleague Tony, who I think has spent some time over here before. He's in Tallinn now at the moment.
Another question. How do you work together with the Open Knowledge Foundation, Sunlight Foundation, Code for America, and
right?
Different
That's a really interesting point. We were at, so the question is fundamentally, how are we engaged with other groups doing the same thing, right? So the first thing is, we're on very good terms with all these people, and in fact, we were at Transparency Camp in Washington, at Sunlight's Transparency Camp 2-3 weeks ago, where we were sharing this idea as well. A very significant problem in the world, this is going to get a bit philosophical, is people don't always get on with each other. And one of the key things about this federation is it's not okay for mySocietyj to say, here's a thing we've written, you should use it because it worked for us. So what the federation is about mySocietyj, who have been doing this a long time, Ciudadano Inteligente, Sunlight, anyone who's written one of these things, to try and disassociate ownership from it, to make it more likely that people will use it. Because there are lots of good reasons why you might not want to use another group's code, or you maybe had problems with them in the past. There is a human aspect to this which we're trying to resolve. Now, the Open Knowledge Foundation, maybe some of you are going to Berlin this year. We go to the conferences because they have a great network. They're doing something slightly different. They're not in the business of providing the software. Fundamentally, this is about the underlying software, which accidentally often becomes a really useful website when it's running alone. So it's solving a different problem, but we're embracing that as well. And Sunlight, I'd love to tell you we have a Sunlight component in there already. We don't, but I'm sure we will very soon. And in fact, that's a bit of a trick, because we're trying to get rid of the idea. For example, the simple thing is that our code ends up on the Populous website, not on the mySocietyj websites. There's this idea of trying to break the ownership as part of it. The fact that such groups are well known isn't a problem, but it's emphatically not going to be a problem what we're trying to do. That was a long answer for a good question.
You have mentioned politicians.
Yep.
Could you tell us what obstacles did you have working with them?
Yeah, now, anyone who's done... So the question was fundamentally, to check this is right, how do we get on with authority when we do this stuff, right? So a really good example of right to them. What do they... Okay. They Work For You, our parliamentary tracking website. They Work For You, the UK parliamentary tracking website, sends email alerts when somebody speaks about, when your MP speaks. So we had one MP stand up and announce that it was her wedding anniversary the next day because she knew that her husband subscribed to our alerts. That's an indication when the institution has embraced what you're doing. But to start with, FixMyStreet, we did not ask anyone's permission. We crowdsourced contact details for the councils and started sending them problems anyway. We run a service called Write to Them, which lets you send an email normally to your elected representative. That was the first mySocietyj project. It was called Fax Your MP. You didn't need a fax. You didn't need to know who your MP was. That's an example of the civic tech working. Some of that was received quite hostile, and some MPs do not receive email in the UK now, partly because of spam. Our service will not send a message if it looks like somebody has sent something similar before, so we're filtering for them as well. That's a key thing. With FixMyStreet, for example, some of the UK councils pay us to implement it on their sites, which is an indication, again, of how successful it is. Ideally, instead of sending email, we like to inject problems directly into their back-end systems. We use an open standard called Open 311, if you've come across that before, for reporting these things. But the situation in the UK is pretty good. The UK government website, really, if you're bored, go and have a look at gov.uk because it is fabulous. It's run by the Government Digital Service, which is now headed by an ex-director of mySocietyj. They do user testing, it's open source. You can, and it has happened, submit a pull request to your government's website. How cool is that? So the government is doing very well. UK Parliament is slightly different. UK Parliament has been doing its thing for 800 years. It's not going to change quickly. But because the government website is now very good, Parliament potentially is embarrassed, because one thing which has changed in the world is normal, non-technical people know a good website from a bad website. My mother would know the difference between surfing on the BBC website and looking at her local council website, for example. And this now is a problem for people in power that they need to fix it. The UK Parliament, various events happened, meant they needed to fix this problem, so they invited consultants to tell them how to reform their use of IT. You can imagine this was a great, tempting contract for the big consulting companies. The winners of that consulting contract was mySocietyj. We had been making this website for about 8-9 years, I think, for theyworkforyou.com, that was clearly better in providing a service than what Parliament's own website was doing. So eventually, after this needling, eventually they said, come in and help us do better. Now that's a great story for people who are at the start of that journey, that it really can happen. And you haven't seen the changes yet, but it's starting, and there are limitations to what could be achieved. But I'm not naive, because we work with groups in very hostile places as well. The guys in Malaysia are doing a great job against a fairly uncooperative local government. And sometimes you have to batter away anyway. For example, the Spanish Freedom of Information site was running even though there's no FOI law in place. Because just by doing it, you are gathering a body of evidence that there is a public demand for it. So does that kind of cover the kind of things you were asking? Yep.
Hi, I have a question about implementation of FixMyStreet.
Yep.
So when a user reports a problem
Yep.
and the request goes to his MP or member of parliament, something like that, does he get a reply, yeah, you've been heard or something like that?
Right. FixMyStreet sends the report to the government department that's going to fix your problem. So that could be your local council or your district council. It won't be your MP to start with. And that report goes to them with your email. So the council, if they want to engage with you, and some councils do, will reply directly to you. It can become a personal correspondence. So it really is a way of reporting the problem, but we don't own the communication that then happens. Okay?
More questions? No more questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you very much for understanding my Croatian. Thank you.